Hey, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I see most people are still joining us. However, in the interest of time, we do have a very packed agenda this morning, so we will just proceed. My name is Dora Mudise, and I'm the Executive Director of the Presidential Climate Commission. So welcome and thank you very much for joining us on today's webinar. Quite excited to see a number of people that are on this call today and looking forward to very stimulating, but then also timely discussions as we look at how global geopolitical changes and the uncertainty that we are experiencing is impacting on the economy, energy transition, but then also industrial competitiveness. So today's discussion comes at a very particular moment and a very important moment for us. We are seeing that now change is the new normal. Every day brings new dynamics in the space. So as a result, the three advisory commissions of the president, that is the National Planning Commission, the Presidential Climate Commission, as well as the President's Economic Advisory Council, came together to really look at these issues, and the three commissions or bodies released a draft discussion paper that explores how South Africa can respond strategically to rapidly changing global environment while advancing a long-term development objective. This really is a great moment that demonstrates the importance of collaboration and ensuring that we are all working towards the same outcome per se, because really the development and growth of the economy is an interest is the interest of all of us. So what makes this conversation today particularly valuable is that it's going to go beyond challenges. It will ask for practical choices for South Africa, what we need to strengthen energy security, accelerate industrial development, expand investment, and also ensure transition to a low carbon economy at the same time. In most instances, discussion pant these variables against each other, but we do believe that they are mutually reinforcing, and it's through such conversations that we will be able to bring all the moving pieces together. So we've got a great panel today. So we're going to listen to really three substantive presentations on the geopolitical context itself, what we've included in this draft paper, but then also moving into the financing elements that needs to then come in. As the speakers come on board, I will introduce them accordingly. But all of these meant to stimulate the discussion that will follow, which would really enable us to strengthen this particular paper. So before I get into the substantial part of the session itself, let me start. As I said, this is a collaboration between the three bodies: the Presidential Climate Commission, the President's Economic Advisory Council, and the National Planning Commission. So I'm going to start with you, Dr. Renosi Mokate, who's the chairperson of the PEAC, the Presidential Economic Advisory Council, to request you to give us a bit of an overview and framing of the webinar. Thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Mokate. I think you are muted. We can't hear you. No, and your audio was working perfectly well earlier. I'm not sure what. Am I the only one, Tabiseng? Can you hear Dr. Mokate?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now. You can go ahead.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for the introduction. I am going to look at do an overview and framing of the webinar. So let me start by wishing you all a very good morning, my colleagues, distinguished speakers and participants. And I also wish to thank and acknowledge the members of the Presidential Climate Commission, the National Planning Commission, and the Presidential Economic Advisory Council for convening this important dialogue. The context is that the global environment is becoming increasingly uncertain. Escalating conflict, heightened trade tensions, volatility in the energy markets, changing investment patterns, and growing competition over strategic technologies and critical minerals are shaping the global economy. These developments, however, are not merely temporary disruptions. They may signal deeper structural shifts in global production, trade, finance, and energy system. It is in the context of this backdrop that the NPC, the PCC, and the PEAC established a joint working group, each institution bringing its distinct but complementary perspective, specifically long-term national planning, climate policy and just transition, as well as economic growth and development. The working group has prepared a joint advisory note examining what these global changes mean for South Africa. In particular, it considers the risks arising from our exposure to important fuels, fossil fuels, the international supply disruptions, and volatile global markets, whilst also identifying opportunities presented by the transition towards more electricity-intensive and lower carbon economies. The advisory does not attempt to address every sector affected by geopolitical change. Rather, it focuses primarily on the electricity system and the industrial opportunities associated with its transformation. Its central position is that energy security, industrial development, economic competitiveness, and the just transition should not be treated as separate policy objectives. They must form part of a coherent national development strategy. Reliable, affordable, and increasingly clean electricity can be the foundation for greater investment, industrial expansion, employment creation, as well as long-term economic resilience. At the same time, the expansion of generation, transmission, and distribution infrastructure must be used deliberately to strengthen domestic manufacturing, increase skills and productive capacity, while ensuring that the benefits are broadly shared. Today's seminar is therefore not intended simply to present a complete document. The advisory remains a draft for consultation. The purpose of this dialogue today is to test its analysis, widen the discussion, and help refine the recommendations before a final advisory note is submitted to the presidency and the relevant government ministers. I would therefore encourage us to consider 4 strategic questions during today's discussions. The first is, how can South Africa reduce its vulnerability to external energy, trade, and financial shocks? Secondly, how can the transformation of the electricity system support industrialization, competitiveness, and employment? Thirdly, how can energy, industrial trade, infrastructure, finance, and climate policies be more effectively aligned? And finally, how do we ensure that this transition broadens economic participation rather than enforcing existing patterns of inequality and concentrated ownership? These questions reflect the webinar's broader objective, which is to move beyond short-term crisis management and consider the long-term strategic choices required to strengthen South Africa's economic resilience and development prospects. We will now hear from Dr. Kenneth Creamer on the changing geopolitical context, followed by Lebogang Blaisi on the key messages of the draft advisory, and Professor Mark Swilling on the financing requirements and challenges. We look forward to a constructive and forward-looking discussion that will help shape a stronger and more coherent final advisory. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mokate. I do note that I did a bit of an ubu at the beginning. So, Prof. Maluleke, I am going to call you in a moment for a National Planning Commission opening perspective before moving on to Kenneth. Yes, I can see some of you have started doing so. We do encourage you to introduce yourselves on the chat. That helps us a lot in understanding who's in the room and including in the recording of this meeting. So do put your name and where you are coming from. And do stay muted throughout the discussion. You will unmute as and when we recognize you to speak later on when we do a Q&A session. Let me now, for the next few minutes, hand over to you, Prof. Maluleke, with an NPC perspective, opening perspective and framing.
Thank you very much, Program Director. I'm going to welcome everyone after they have already been welcomed, so I'll try and keep it very short. I take pleasure in welcoming each and every participant in this multi-stakeholder webinar. I do it not just on behalf of the National Planning Commission, but also on behalf of the Presidential Climate Commission and the Presidential Economic Advisory Council. That has been my brief, and it is an honor to do so. We all know that each of these three bodies regularly conduct or commission research and craft reports and advisories to government on critical economic and national developmental issues. But this time around, the three bodies have written a rare and, in my view, a timely joint advisory. Such are the geopolitical conditions in the world at this time, and such are the constraints. Similarly, there are grave risks and opportunities contending, and these are applicable to our country as much as they are also applicable to the whole world. It is at times like this that disparate sector by sector or even commission by commission responses are inadequate. They are no longer adequate, and hence the three commissions have come together to put out this joint advisory, which will be basically the bone that we are going to chew together today. The seminal ideas in it will be discussed today. I will not go at length to talk about each of the commissions that I have referred to, other than just say that I look forward to this webinar, which is aptly titled Navigating Global Geopolitical Change and Uncertainty. The webinar will discuss, in my view, some of the most important ideas doing the rounds in the world today, but also in our country, aimed at helping our country to navigate better the geopolitical waters by leveraging long-term planning and focusing on industrial development and focusing in particular on energy transition. I welcome you all to this multi-stakeholder webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Prof. Maluleke, Chairperson of the National Planning Commission. Okay, so with that framing by the two chairs of the PEAC and the NPC, I will now hand over to Dr. Kenneth Creamer to just give us a bit of a global geopolitical context. Kenneth, I'm now taking 5 minutes from your time. You have 15 minutes. I hope you'll manage to wrap it up in that time, but very important to just frame the shifts that we are currently seeing before we get into the document itself. Over to you, Kenneth.
Thank you very much. So I'm very grateful to the organizers of this timely event and appreciate the comments made by the previous speakers. As you say, I've been asked to talk about a framing of the geopolitical crisis or the key points that we can discern from it. They say when the facts change, our opinions need to change. And when the world changes, I think as well, the advice that we give needs to change. So 4 brief headings for my input: identification of current global energy trends, some data insights, how does this impact on South Africa's economic planning, and then which path will we ultimately choose? So some of the trends that we are seeing in the world, it's a very fluid situation, as we know, and the situation changes from day to day. And you could say that the world is always changing, but I think sometimes it changes more slowly and sometimes it changes more quickly. And we're going through some very significant trends which should impact on South Africa's economic planning. Some of these trends did pre-exist the current conflict in the Middle East, as well as the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict, which both impacted heavily on the energy prices, gas and oil prices. But some of them are deeper technological changes, transitions in AI, transitions in energy production, which are also being accelerated by the current conflict. So trend 1 would be a disincentive for the importation of fossil fuels, seems to be discernible. Shocks to oil and gas prices are creating disincentive, and many economies are trying to transition away and look at greater levels of energy security. Trend 2, that the geopolitics are accelerating the energy transition. The investment in renewable energy was probably originally driven by policy when we wanted to save the climate and save the world. Then it became driven by price advantages as it became cheaper, and is now largely also being driven by geopolitical and energy security considerations. So it's lining up in that sense. Some people say, well, there's another factor. There's also contestation and ideological decisions around energy. But I would say the flow is from policy imperatives, price advantages, and now geopolitical and energy security considerations. A trend that is very important as well is electrification is increasing. So economies around the world are getting more of their energy, not from combustion and from burning fossil fuels, but generally the proportion of energy that comes from electrification, from electrons rather than burnt molecules, is a trend that is taking place and is being accelerated. It's quite visible in mobility, where there's more electric or new energy vehicles, but also in industrial processes, we're seeing more electric power. Trend 4, as Renosi mentioned in her introduction, there's an alignment that many countries are presenting between their industrial and energy policies. So governments are actively pursuing industrial policy interventions upstream and downstream of the new energy value chains. So it's increasing investment in grid infrastructure, electricity equipment, critical minerals upstream, battery production downstream, and South Africa needs to look at its positioning in that regard. And also this increased productivity that's linked to services as well. Artificial intelligence applications cannot be really separated from this energy transition. So some data from the recently released statistical review of world energy. Insight 1, oil shocks have effects on oil consumption. So if you look at that diagram there, the orange line shows you the increase in oil consumption during the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. If that trend had continued, it would have been up at 200,000 joules or hectojoules at that time. But the actual effect after the crisis of 1970, the first war in the Middle East, and then the Iranian Revolution in 1979, saw that the market responds to these higher prices and to the disruption of supply. In particular, in that time, a lot of countries opted for nuclear energy to replace their oil-based systems. Number 2, local sources of energy are being prioritized. So you can see from this diagram that first I'll show you Europe and then Pakistan, avoiding of fossil fuel import costs due to added wind and solar just in the years 22 to 2025. So billions of euros in these cases in the countries showing there, Germany, Spain, and Italy, and others, through investment in wind and solar, have been able to avoid the importation of fossil fuels, both in the form of hard coal and gas. And in Pakistan, the avoidance has been through, as in South Africa, a huge uptake in rooftop solar. I think we're about 10 maybe gigawatts. They've moved to 20 gigawatts of rooftop solar, to the point that 20% of Pakistan's electricity generation is now coming from that little green mark at the bottom, is now coming from rooftop solar, another important trend in many countries. The process is highly contested and uneven throughout the world. So some oil and gas exporting countries, obviously, they benefit from this trade and they are being highly disrupted. Saudi Arabia and others are trying to diversify their energy sources and their economies, understanding that they are not diversified and are at risk against these trends that are taking place. If you look at the diagram at the top right, that's the change in carbon intensity of total energy production in 2025. All regions of the world have reduced their carbon intensity, if you look from the bottom up, quite significantly, except one region, where it's the drill baby drill kind of idea that the carbon intensity is increasing in North America, driven particularly by the US economy. But the lower one shows the electrification point that I was talking about earlier. In all countries, US, Europe, the electricity generation as a share of total energy has been rising. There's some deep physics and economic benefits from that, and that we can't go into now. But one country in particular has accelerated its electrification process, being China, where more than 25% of its energy is based on electricity supply. It's not happening evenly. Africa, for example, we have 19% of the world's population, but only 3.6% of the world's energy supply in 2025. So the challenge in Africa is not so much about decarbonizing an existing energy system, as we know, but in mobilizing and in building electrification and energy system for African economies. For Africa, a key threat of the current conflict is that the cost of borrowing is rising, which makes this building of a new system more costly and more difficult. For South Africa, we have got a more developed energy system, and we are atypical of many other African countries, and we are less capital constrained. And I suppose what I'm just going to reflect on for the next few slides before I close is that the risk for us is more of not reading the signs of the times correctly, possibly making policy errors. Our energy transition in this country is still at its very early stages, and there are some risks that it will be delayed or derailed if we don't read the signs of the times correctly, which is a major motivation for the coming together of these three advisory bodies to say, how do we interpret the signs of the times, and what is our advice? So how does this impact on South African economic planning? It exposes risks and opportunities for us. We are a net importer of crude oil and refined petroleum products. We're highly exposed to global fuel price shocks, exchange rate volatility, disruptions, etc. We saw our government responded correctly as much as it could afford with fuel levy reductions in the early days. If you remember that fateful morning on the 28th of February, when we heard that Iran had been struck, we later found out the supreme leader had been killed in those early strikes. Government responded within a few weeks to say, well, we're going to reduce fuel levies to reduce the impact on households and businesses. But these are necessarily temporary interventions. And the impulse that brought us together was to say, what do we do more longer term? How do we advise the economy to evolve to make itself more resilient and less vulnerable to these kind of shocks? I mean, it affects industrial policy, it affects macroeconomic policy. I think others like Mark will speak about financial matters, but it also particularly electricity planning, liquid fuels planning. Electricity policy needs to remain laser focused on achieving a competitive path for future electricity prices. If the world is electrifying, if that is going to be the competitive advantage of industrial processes, we cannot afford to continue with electricity price increases that we have seen, it becomes an energy constraint on our growth path if we allow this to continue. In that context, the restructuring of Eskom and the wider electricity sector must be designed to ensure security of supply, including for poor households, increased levels of investment in grid and generation capacity, and price containment. So we're not saying we're going to get lower prices, but we need to not be on a higher price path going forward, but on a low possible price path going forward. And price competition among generators based on a competitive grid access is the model that seems most likely to achieve that. We speak a lot in our electricity, just transition in our electricity policy. We need pathways for negatively affected, and it's important politically that the opposition to the energy transition needs to be fairly dealt with by having alternative pathways. But we must also remember that the just transition is about a transition which aims to secure wider economic benefits of growth and new employment through the economy. So cannot only be determined by those whose interests are negatively affected, they must be ameliorated and assisted, but the wider benefits of the transition are important to our growth and employment. Liquid fuels, government has announced that it wishes to stipulate greater strategic fuel reserve holdings to hold more fuel both for the government and the private sector. Seems like a legitimate intervention. Some private sector companies have suggested that it might impact on their have costs for them, and I think those will have to be discussed. And it's against the background where we haven't actually faced shortages of any material extent since this crisis started. So it would be a very different discussion today if we had been going to the fuel pumps and there wasn't fuel available to us. And there was a very swift move of our supply from, instead of getting Middle East refined product and raw product, it was coming from the Atlantic Basin, Brazil, the US, Angola, countries up the west coast of Africa. So that has been quite an interesting and rapid change in South Africa's oil liquid fuels access. But I think the point that is being made, if you read the global trends, is that our longer term plan should be to reduce fuel imports over time and to shift to new energy vehicles, including in public transport system, in order to move away from that dependency. We must also remember the background that a number of our refineries have closed in recent years as they were proven to be uncompetitive. So the last bit now, Dora, I won't be much longer. I didn't keep an eye on the time. If you look here, this is South Africa's growth path. It's a bit small, but the red line is our GDP growth rates. The green one is the emerging economies, and the world average is the blue line. And South Africa is a relatively open economy. We always do get affected by these global shocks and trends. So I don't have a pointer here, but if you look in the 1980s, the red line is way below the other lines. That was the crisis of apartheid, lack of investment, financial sanctions. Our growth fell very much down. Then in the period of the 2000s, the post-apartheid dividend, the democratic dividend, the high cycle of commodity prices, our red line moves right up to the world average and above it. Then in the later era of poor governance, state capture, COVID, all of that, we fall way off we fall way below global growth, and we're stuck in those doldrums of negative per capita GDP growth. So the question is, as we're planning here, we need to ensure that we will never be able to avoid the cycle, being an open economy. But we need to try to increase what economists call our potential growth rate, so that our potential growth rate, our growth potential will be at a higher level, so that and we are less vulnerable to the ups and downs of those global trends. The poor policy response to the current crisis would likely mean that we continue to underperform, deepening and prolonging the ongoing phase of negative per capita growth with all that entails. There will be challenges along the way that's highly contested. A capable and ethical state is required to lead the planning process, and that is in question. Do we have that capable and ethical state? And to be effective, government planning needs to be both embedded in the realities of the South African economy. So it can't be just pie in the sky, but it must also be autonomous of vested interests. To be an effective developmental state, you need to be able to, I think the Chinese said, development is the hard truth. So you need to be able to be embedded and realistic, but you need to be autonomous of vested interests. And there are some signs that our energy transition is beginning to stall. It's still quite nascent. There's disagreement over the unbundling of Eskom. Regulations for the wholesale market, wheeling, are facing delays. If you looked at the beginning of the year, the deadline, the timetable is not being adhered to. And this really risks a situation where if we're unable to sustain this reform momentum, South Africa risks remaining on a path of energy-constrained growth, particularly if electricity and other energy costs continue to rise and we do not achieve the goal of a lower price path going forward. And this would be a very suboptimal outcome. So what is required as well is a close alignment between industrial and energy policy. Recently, government released the Industrial Development Strategy. It seeks to align policy interventions with the 3 Ds of decarbonization, digitization, and diversification. So I think this is a positive development. It intends to change the structure of the South African economy in line with the logic of the world's emerging new power systems and new industrial systems. It has to be forward-looking. It has to promote energy-intensive industries, electric vehicles, battery manufacturing, green hydrogen, transmission equipment, fertilizer. There's many things that are part of that policy which show that it's trying to align with the trends that I have identified. For the plans to build 14,000 kilometers of transmission line and invest in generation equipment and modernize grid, if that is implemented, and there's, again, South Africa's disease of are we going to implement, when are we going to implement, are we going to implement properly, that would be a game changer for South African manufacturing. The demand for steel, for cement, for construction, for electric equipment would be vast. So the last slide is just saying, which path will we choose? Once we've read the sign of the times, once we see the direction the world is moving in, will we be able to choose the correct path to reduce dependence on imported fossil fuels, strengthen domestic industrial capabilities, build new energy systems? These policy choices will determine whether the country remains vulnerable as we are to future external shocks, or if we can emerge more resilient. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kenneth. And indeed, I think the key question here is which path are we taking in terms of policy choices? Quite complicated given the number of challenges that you've outlined for us there, but set a very great tone now for Labour's presentation that is about to follow, that goes into the draft advisory paper, which starts to really delve into key actions that we might need to consider, but then also most importantly, setting a tone for the discussion later on. We really look forward to hearing inputs from participants in terms of how we stack these different initiatives and how do we move the country forward. There is a Q&A function on the chat. Please, as we go through the presentations, do type your questions on the Q&A, which will assist us in facilitating the Q&A session later on. Over to you, Lebogang from the PCC, to present then on key messages coming from the advisory note. You have 15 minutes, Lebo.
Thanks. I'm gonna try my best to keep to the 15 minutes. So the previous speakers have done an awesome job to kind of lay the foundation for what the geopolitical crisis and this kind of geopolitical change means in terms of, I like how Kenneth has put it, reading the times and making use of that reading to align it to South Africa's long-term planning trajectory and to identify what this means in terms of our growth potential, industrial development, as well as more broadly the just transition. So, I mean, the previous speakers have already talked about, the global economic order, right, that is being accelerated by the current geopolitical crisis and the structural shifts that are currently taking place in the global economy. And if we had to kind of put this into sort of like different sort of quadrants, we'd look at the fact of what it means in terms of just broadly fragmentation in terms of the geopolitical environment that we currently find ourselves in. What we're seeing is that there is a reorganizing of blocks, economic blocks, competing blocks, and strategic alliances. And this is really done in the efforts to secure economic security for particular countries. So we're seeing just this broad renegotiation of strategic alliances. Kenneth has talked a lot about, what the current sort of crisis means in terms of electricity supply. Most countries are prioritizing reducing their dependence on particularly the imports of crude oil. Most of the countries that have been able to have a greater degree of domestic energy resilience have been those countries that have reduced their dependence on crude oil. We're clearly seeing a return of industrial policy. I think every country is now taking industrial policy quite seriously. And again, this is to shore up your own economic resilience as well as localization, again, in a way to build up sort of domestic resilience over and above issues related to trade. But another thing that's already starting to take place is, again, with the geopolitical fragmentation, we're now starting to see that there's a reconfiguration of trade and investments as well. Whereas the countries in the Middle East, particularly the petrostates, are now also having realized the exposure that they have in terms of the current crisis, and are looking to diversify their markets and their energy markets, again, to protect yourself and to reduce dependence and shore up your own resilience. And this is starting to emanate even in the South African case, looking at how do you restructure, renegotiate regional trade, how to attract new markets, and how you look at new investment corridors. I'm not going to go into this too much. I think Kenneth's presentation did go into how South Africa, on the onset of the crisis, responded. This depiction is just the fuel price data that we sourced at the beginning of the Middle East war. And obviously, we don't have to tell anybody in this room what this meant and what impact was felt. We all saw the rise in the petrol and diesel price, as well as what this meant for just general cost of living. But most interestingly, what I want to highlight is the line in red around what this has also meant for the price of paraffin, because that has drastically increased. And I'm highlighting the price of paraffin because of its impact on poor households, and quite a number of poor households are still dependent on paraffin to fuel cooking and heating. And the fuel levy that the rest of us would have benefited from in terms of petrol prices as well as diesel prices, there was no mechanism to cushion households that are reliant on paraffin. So depending on what happens in terms of the geopolitical crisis and how it unfolds in the months to come, the relief that was sought through the fuel levy, we need to find mechanisms to ensure that even households dependent on paraffin do receive some sort of subsidy. Within the advisory, we looked at, given that there are these changes that are being felt as a result of the crisis, what should be the current priorities and actionable options that we have as a country to advise in terms of the three commissions that have come together. And what we looked at in terms of actionable options for the current priorities have been around issues related to economic and market stability, energy security and reform, as well as how do you promote competition in the electricity sector, but most importantly, how do you address issues related to structural inequality. So the advisory then zeroes in on the question of, energy security, but most importantly, looking at how do you accelerate least cost renewable energy transmission expansion, battery storage, as well as flexible peaking capacity, in line with the initial finding that it is important for national sovereignty, and as well as to minimize your vulnerability to crude oil shocks. It's important that you accelerate least costs, particularly renewable energy expansion. And this is in line with a number of findings from previous studies that have identified that this strategy is indeed a no-regret strategy for the country. Kenneth has touched on the point around electricity market reform that is currently underway here in South Africa. Yes, at a nascent stage, but it is important, as currently the rules of the electricity market are currently being determined, particularly through process initiated by NERSA. It is important to ensure that we can ensure fair access and competition within the electricity market, but also to support transparent market rules, as well as to send signals to the market, as well as to investors, that more and more independent players are welcome into the market, so that we can ensure that there is sufficient competition, so that the prices of electricity can sufficiently be reduced. It's also important to ensure that we move away from any form of market concentration. I mean, we do understand that the electricity market probably needs some time to mature in South Africa, but it's important to ensure that the market does incentivize competition, as opposed to entrenching market concentration. So also the question around strengthening the independence of the transmission operator is really important. And there's been a lot of conversations around how do you do this from the point of view of the balance sheet of the transmission operator. Again, this has also been talked about. We need 14,000 kilometers of new grid lines. And again, this is probably the largest infrastructure program that we've had since 1994, and it is foundational in the sense that it will ensure that we have the necessary energy security and growth, but most importantly, in the manner in which we design this program, it has huge benefits for localization, the reinvigoration of steel capacity in the country, as well as skills development for this particular program to take shape. Now, there's sometimes a misconception around electricity reform, as well as just the various other activities around bringing on board a mass amount of renewable energy capability. Usually the debate, and sometimes this is an ideological debate, it's around private sector participation within electricity generation. But it is important to note that there is an opportunity here to still address issues related to structural inequality and concentration of wealth. And this can be done by ensuring that more and more cooperatives, whether they are worker cooperatives, community cooperatives, women-led cooperatives, are introduced into the system, so that we can support municipal, community, as well as cooperative ownership, even in renewable energy generation, to also avoid the recreation of a concentration of ownership, but to promote local value creation, as well as broader participation. The graphs just show Gini coefficients that can transpire under a carbon constraint in two scenarios. What we show there is that wage inequality is not addressing just wage inequality is not sufficient. We need to go broader than that. And the way in which we do that is to ensure that we break the concentrations of ownership and assure that there is participation of previously disadvantaged groups in our transition. The medium-term priorities are around issues related to industrial policy and competitiveness, the need for integrated energy planning, climate change and emissions reduction, repositioning structural change, as well as investment and financing of electricity infrastructure, which I'm not going to go into because that will be part of Mark's presentation. The point around industrial policy and competitiveness has already been covered in the previous presentation. The most important thing to highlight in this section is that the 3 pillars for the industrial development strategy are key, with decarbonization being a part of those pillars. It's important through this process to ensure that there is sufficient grid infrastructure that is localized. Green industrialization opportunities and export potential is important. But really, the key takeaway here and the ethos of the advisories has been around electricity reform. It's to ensure that through the IDS, the electricity that we end up putting into the grid, companies can get that electricity at very low prices, so that we can shore up industrial policy and competitiveness capability within the economy. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritties of the slide. It's just a depiction, really, of South Africa's energy balance, which must take us towards the point of integrated energy planning. So Kenneth touched on the point around liquid fuels and what do we do around liquid fuels. Do we build more refineries? What is it that we're doing as a country to ensure our own resilience? The answer to those types of questions is in an integrated energy plan. Because in doing an integrated energy plan, we will then be able to identify what is it that we have, what is it that we need in terms of our energy planning needs, and what goals are we moving towards as a country. And once we have answered those questions, we can then answer the questions around what is strategic, what does government need to invest in, what does the private sector need to invest in to ensure that we shore up our own energy planning needs. The important takeaway here is that we need to do this to also avoid risking investing in stranded assets. I'm almost done. So this is the consolidated advice that's come from the advisory, and basically touches on just the short-term and the long-term sort of strategic areas that require intervention that I've already touched on in the presentation so far. And really what it also takes us down to is just a number of interventions that are required to ensure that we do achieve the reforms that we require in the electricity sector. We do link those to industrial development and industrial strategies, and achieve the just transition at the same time, because these, again, as has been said, are not competing priorities. So in conclusion, the geopolitical crisis, it is a structural turning point, but South Africa can emerge more resilient, competitive and inclusive through accelerated energy transition and industrial transformation. Thank you, Edie. That is my last slide.
Thank you very much, Lebo. You actually did well with time. So let us now take our third and final input before we open the floor for discussion. I now welcome Prof. Mark Swilling, who will discuss the scale and nature of investment required, financing constraints and opportunities, as well as the role of public and private sector in terms of supporting economic transformation and resilience, but also in line with the challenges that have been mapped today, the initiatives that we are looking at, and the advisory that is coming through. So, Mark, let me hand over to you. You have 15 minutes. Mark? Do we have Mark on the line? He was on the line earlier.
We seem to have lost him a bit there, but he's rejoining.
Sorry. I lost my connection just then.
I can hear you. Over to you, Mark.
Okay. Let me just get the presentation. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to mainly just share quite a bit of information from reports that the NPC has published last year and this year. But the point of departure for me is very much the core focus of this session, which is the impact of the Iran war. And for me, there are two particularly important ones. One is the acceleration of renewables. And there's a lot of evidence in various parts of the world that this is happening. And the second is de-dollarization, in particular with the increasingly aggressive positions adopted by the Chinese. But as long as sometimes I wonder whether the de-dollarization argument is being overstated, because as long as the bulk of debt remains denominated in USD, it might be too early to refer to that. But I think we'll look back on the Iran war in years to come as a key turning point in the global energy and global financial system. I think it's important. I use this diagram from my colleague in the NTSA, Ronald Murray, because I don't have much time to say very much about the power sector reform process, other than to signal in the top left the key drivers of what's making the power sector reform process necessary, what the journey is about from a vertically integrated system to a system which has been unbundled into generation, transmission, and distribution, and the creation of markets and a new set of rules with a stated objective of reliability, affordability, and investability. The key risks are signaled here, and I don't have time to really go into them. They are the risks that the task team appointed by the president in February at the SONA has to deal with, and the final report of the task team has now been completed but remains confidential. The key mechanisms that will shape the future, this refers to what people were referring to. We need to get this right. There's many risks that will make some key strategic and policy mistakes, but it's about capacity and adequacy. It's about flexibility. So you can't just add renewables and keep coal-fired power stations going, because that creates the problem we have now, which is too much electricity in the middle hours of the day. You need network security, stability of the system. The most important reform, which is hardly discussed and very little work has been done, is on tariff reform, unbundling the tariff so that you can manage the grid properly, an affordability framework, and the strategic reliability backstop, which will depend on the capacity to manage change. So this is just a very brief picture of how I see the energy reform. It's really, we need to take into account the context, which is the amount of energy we currently generate in 2025 is not much different to what it was 20 years ago. But as reflected in this diagram, we're talking about a decline in what's generated from Eskom plant and an increase in non-Eskom plant. As a percentage, this is what it looks like. So the drivers, which we all know, but this has now been well documented by my colleagues at Stellenbosch, which really shows that tariff increases have been way above CPI improvements. But that's not the only driver. One of the consequences of rising costs has been the reduced electricity intensity of the economy, whereas many other countries are trying to increase electricity intensity in order to reduce dependence on fossil fuel-based energy systems. So with that very brief background in mind, what we did in the National Planning Commission was to do an assessment of the investment requirements to achieve net zero and energy security by 2050. And we developed 3 scenarios, which took into account on the top line where the world might be going, aligned around 1.5 degree warming or fragmented. In other words, not much agreement. And then a world according to Trump, where we just forget about warming altogether and the consequences. And on the left-hand side, the 3 key scenarios in the South African context: green industrialization, the market forces scenario, and business as usual. And we did very detailed modeling with funding from the DBSA for this work. And I'm going to just share with you some of the basic outcomes in terms of capacity, with respect to both generation and the grid, as well as the costings. So for the most intensive period is really the 5 years leading up, or the 6 years leading up to 2030, where in terms of the modeling to within a 2.1 gigaton carbon budget suggests a 60 gigawatt target for renewable energy, including battery storage, which is not that far where we are actually going, because we're overbuilding compared to the RP targets. But it would require fairly significant acceleration of coal closure and the building of significant amounts of gas as backup, and wind and battery storage. The market forces scenario is similar to the RP 2025, which has got different outcomes and a more expansive carbon budget. And if you then cast your eye to the 2031 to 50 period, we're looking at going up to 200 gigawatts of renewables, and reducing to around 10 gigawatts of coal by 2050 on condition CCS, carbon capture and storage, is financially viable. In terms of the costs, the green scenario, scenario A, does work out cheaper over this period, mainly because when you accelerate coal closure, you're reducing your coal requirement, which reduces the OPEX budget considerably. You will need more CapEx for your grid. And so you can see here from these figures what the differences are between the different scenarios. I'll show you in a minute how this compares to the RP. But just to say, when it comes to CapEx, if you add generation and the grid, it's 2 trillion. The annual average is 78 billion. The current levels of private sector investment, which is confirmed by both our market sounding analysis in this report, as well as the PCC report on the landscape of climate finance, of roughly around 100 billion sources. What that means is that there's a gap for the 2025, sorry, that should be 2024, 2030 period of around 12 to 15 billion. But after 2030, that gap goes away because there's a very big upfront investment in the green scenario, which then levels out. So you would need to keep that 100 billion levels of investment going, if not increasing. The carbon emissions impacts of that are represented here. The blue line is the ambitious green scenario. Our forces scenario also comes down fairly quickly, which is similar to the RP 2025, but the business as usual scenario obviously doesn't. If you compare this to the RP 2025, you can see, if you just look on the right-hand side, the RP 2025 envisages roughly 14 gigawatts of solar and 13 gigawatts of wind by 2030, whereas the green scenario that I'm talking about is looking at higher amounts. However, what's interesting is that we estimated that you need a lot of battery backup to stabilize the grid, whereas the RP is only looking at 4 gigawatts. We looked at 11, and we are more ambitious when it comes to gas, although there's very little likelihood that gas is actually going to happen, no matter which study you're looking at, by 2030, which, according to medium-term advisory outlook, could trigger the return of load shedding in 2029. But as you can see, coal comes down quite quickly with our scenario compared to RP. But if you look at the 2040 scenario, things get a little closer with respect to renewables, gas, but the battery storage, there's a major difference, and RP 25 envisages nuclear. But the coal targets are not that different if you assume a 50-year life cycle. So the big question is, where will the funding come from if monetary and fiscal policies remain constant, which was the second set of pieces of work that we did in the NPC. And I'm not suggesting that they should remain constant. I'm just saying if under existing constraints. And what we did is we used a framework called the monetary architecture framework, which breaks away from the traditional distinction between public-private funding to think of the financial ecosystem as a complex adaptive system. And at the core of that is the notion that a financial ecosystem is a web of interlocking balance sheets. And if you want to understand the dynamics of the financial system as a complex adaptive system, you have to understand the relationships between the assets and liabilities of all these clusters of financial institutions. And I don't have time to go into this other than to use this diagram to kind of flash before you what a financial system looks like if you understand it as a complex adaptive system. So what we did in the NPC is we did a number of different infrastructure reports to ask the question, what is the investment requirements to achieve the infrastructure goals of the National Development Plan and its Infrastructure Plan 2050. So from National Development Plan to National Infrastructure Plan, and then asking the question, which we don't ask often enough, which is why we have implementation problems, which is, what is it going to cost? We looked at water infrastructure in detail, energy infrastructure, which I've just shared with you, digital infrastructure, and in a related report that Julian May did, one of the commissioners for the SA Tide research project, which is the research arm of National Treasury, which we worked together with. We also looked at food, and the result was to answer the question, where will the funding come from? Using this understanding of what a monetary architecture was, we produced a 256-page report, which analyzed the evolution of South Africa's monetary architecture over the period 1983 to 2024. And I don't have time to go into it other than to kind of flash this image of what a financial system, what our South African financial system looks like if you understand it as a set of flows. So from a stocks point of view, based on the SARB's whom-to-whom data, which is now visualized, which is now represented here in order to visualize the South African financial system, total assets went up, in other words, stocks from 20 trillion in 2010 to 60 trillion in 2024. This is SARB data. And that's 6.8 times. That means it moved from 6.8 times of GDP to 8 times of GDP. The bottom line is the financial system grows faster than GDP growth. And so the question is, where's the money going? And could it be reinvested in gross fixed capital formation, infrastructure in particular, in a better way? Well, the non-banking financial institutions, their asset base was 18.5 trillion in 2024. Andrew Donaldson assumes a bit less, about 10 point, calculated that to be a bit less using different data. But that's roughly 247% of GDP. And you can see the big blue dot in the middle, that's NBFIs, households which save a bunch of their money, especially the upper income households, save large quantities of money in pension funds, and there are other dots in accordance with their asset base. But this is what the flows look like. Thickness of the lines represents the dimensions of the flows. Now, the real problem is this, which is the decline in gross fixed capital formation, in particular since 2008, with a little bump up around FIFA. But the whole story on the right-hand side is clear to see. If you focus in particular on infrastructure, the pattern is clear. Total, on the right-hand side, the total gross fixed capital formation to GDP is really tracked by investments in infrastructure. And only between 5 and 7% of pension funds investments go into infrastructure. Only 2% of that goes into energy infrastructure, and 45% goes offshore. And this is a configuration, this is all legal according to the rules, which suggests that there's a problem with the rules. And the rules of the game really determine the directionality of capital flows. And if we want to change the directionality of capital flows, we have to change the rules. And this is part of the discussion that needs to take place. Otherwise, we will remain at the bottom end of the upper middle income country scale, which shows that South Africa's investment in gross fixed capital formation is just above Equatorial Guinea and Guatemala. And so the recommendations that are in the NPC report, which are carried through into this advisory, is yes, we need to actually we need a set of balance sheet reconfigurations if we want to redirect capital flows into gross fixed capital formation in particular, in general, but energy infrastructure in particular. We have to increase the amount of money that the non-banking financial institutions invest, in particular the pension funds. We have to strengthen the balance sheets of DFIs with fiscal injections. We need to continue the trajectory of bringing SOEs back in as major investment drivers. Banks need to increase flows to SMMEs. It's just inadequate. We need to possibly think about reducing the size of SARB reserves, which are there which grew massively from after the 2001 currency crisis, so that we have a war chest to fight any future speculative attacks. We need to reverse the outward flow of capital because there's more capital that leaves South Africa that comes into South Africa. We shouldn't overburden fiscal and monetary policy authorities, but maybe there need to be adjustments there. We need to strengthen the regional ZAR payment system, and also we should support and strengthen the non-dollar global payment systems. Just as a small, I suppose, qualifier and apology, the advisory is focused on energy, but obviously we need increased investment in water resilience, in hard-to-abate sectors, in climate-smart agriculture and land use, in biodiversity, in the climate finance market. All of that is important. So although we don't necessarily touch on it in this advisory, those are absolutely key issues if we want to address the challenges that we face, because they can't be separated from energy. So let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark, for that insightful presentation. And thanks again, Lebo and Kenneth. Those presentations were amazing and really laid a great foundation for our discussion that is about to happen. I have been noting a number of comments, both in the Q&A and comments section. So I see participants are using both platforms. So the team in the background, please take those down, but then also the different speakers, you will also check the typed comments and questions that are relevant to you. We will obviously not be able to respond to each and every question. A lot of these comments we will take as inputs that are aimed to strengthen this advisory and correctly put by Mark. And I saw a comment on the chat about adaptation sectors and other areas that are quite critical and that needed to be covered by this advisory. I think let me just point out that this is not the only piece of work that we are going to do together. So perhaps the discussion that will follow will also assist in refining and identifying sectors that would follow once this particular advisory is done. What encourages us is at the moment is just that ability to get together as advisory bodies, noting that we are all moving towards the same objective of growing the economy and ensuring that there's policy coherences across the board. It wouldn't help to continue to work individually on the same kind of a challenge that we are all facing, which is sustained economic growth. So I will check if there are, you can now raise your hands. We will take comments on any of the three presentations that were given. The advisory it has been posted on the site. I've noted that Ntabiseng shared the link also on the chat if you want to access it. I've also noted a number of requests for presentations, which after this webinar, we will post all the presentations for all those that are requesting. So you are most welcome to raise hands if you have any questions. Whilst I wait, not just questions, also inputs and comments. I also noted a number, I think, was it Ms. Theron, right? A number of questions. No, Theron, yeah. There's questions around the SAWEM and the modeling for SAWEM. So, for example, if there's also colleagues from other entities like NERSA that's been working on the wholesale electricity market initiative, but then also I've noted questions around CBAM. If the DTIC is in the room, anyone can really comment on any of those comments and questions that were raised. I noted your hand, Theron, but I see it's now down, so you are covered. Okay, can you speak? Yeah, you may unmute and speak.
And good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I've posed a few questions in the chat, and I guess one of the key ones, I won't go through all of them because I'm sure there might be some time for other questions to be asked. What modeling specifically has been done regarding the South African wholesale energy market with respects to the electricity pricing, the levelized costs of electricity, and its inclusion within the RRP 2025-2026 that was presented earlier this year at the CTICC at the Africa Energy Investment Forum? And if you wouldn't mind, I can just go on with one more of my other questions before lowering my hand. And then with respect to hedging against the impacts of CBAM on our economic sector, particularly with respects to carbon leakage of iron ore, aluminium, and green hydrogen, how are we balancing the aspects of electricity additionality, noting that from that RRP 2025, we are not yet close to our targeted electricity availability factor, whilst also driving our industrialization and decarbonization in the hard-to-abate sectors such as steel manufacturing, aluminium, and e-fuels production, which we know we have seen immense labor, operational, and profit shocks. And then lastly, to what extent have we leveraged our meaningful carbon pricing and the use of a robust and active carbon market in South Africa to drive our just energy transition whilst attracting foreign direct investment in suitable projects? Are we moving beyond virtual signaling, or have we just left this aspect by the wayside with respect to meeting the core tenets of the just energy transition? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's been noted. Let me take 2 more hands and we will get back to your responses to those 2. Commissioner Brandon.
Thanks, Dora, and hi everyone, and congrats to everyone on an amazing piece of work. Just 2 quick inputs. The one around the comment about the concerns that the energy transition is stalling, and that coupled with the need to look out for vested interests. Around Eskom unbundling, around delays with the wholesale electricity market regulations coming into place. These are difficult conversations, but whether it's for the advisory note or subsequent work, is really drilling down into what those factors are that create the stalling and who the role players are. I mean, everyone's got a perspective, and I think for collective understanding of why certain things which could be stalling the transition are in fact taking place, to really explore those and as collectively be able to try and solve those log jams. And then the second one in the advisory note, again, whether it's to strengthen the note or for subsequent work, just a huge concern around these procurement rules by the IPPO and the World Bank that suggests that only international EPC contractors can bid for transmission expansion. I think there's huge lost opportunities there. Perhaps that comes down to vested interests as well. And I think, yeah, that really needs to be strongly addressed. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Commissioner Brandon. Let me go on to Tango. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I think I just want to raise a few issues. Mine is a comment. And the issues I want to raise have got to do with, as speakers have raised, part of the challenge and the shift that are taking place globally are informed by countries that are responding precisely because they are faced with national security challenges and other socio-economic challenges. So if that is a correct point of departure, then to trivialize the public participation or state ownership of the electricity or the energy sector is problematic in 2 instances. The reason that many of the countries now that are shifting towards national ownership, not only of the energy sector, but also of some of the hard-to-abate sectors, is because they don't have trust that the private sector can be able to advance properly the decarbonization agenda. They don't trust that the private sector has the power and the capacity to help in the decarbonization of their economies and meeting also their national security interest. So I think that is the basis of that. So to trivialize the issue of public ownership of the energy sector is wrong. Secondly, because it has a danger to, in the long run, unleash what we have been experiencing in the country, issues around load shedding, unleash some of the problems about electricity prices and all of that. We are moving in an opposite direction to what the global economy is moving. One, the global economy, if you look at the steel industry, most of the, look at Britain just recently, it is nationalizing the steel industry. If you look at the countries that are leading in decarbonization, one of them being China, is that that is done under state ownership, state leading. That is not left into the caprices of the market. So I think, so we need to rethink how we as a country are responding to the geopolitical challenges that are facing our country. If we don't do that, we would continue to repeat the same mistakes that we're making of thinking. I mean, look, for example, there would have never been energy, a big vertically integrated a state-owned energy company like ESCOM if that was not state-led. So I think the illusion that everything must be led to the market actually is the one that is giving us some of the problems that we're facing. And I think that we must actually rethink such an approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tengo. And along the lines of what you are saying in terms of choosing initiatives or which policy positions we take, I guess in this conversation, it would be great if participants can even reflect on, what is the key policy intervention that should be prioritized by government. So we have these conversations and, we've even said it earlier, we need to stack our policy decisions correctly. We need to avoid being reactive to current geopolitical shifts, whilst at the same time still cushioning the economy itself. But the key issue is what is the key initiative or policy shift or amendments that needs to be undertaken. It would be very interesting to get views from participants here today. Let me take you, Babeki. You have the floor. Becky Njali, you can unmute in case you're still muted. I see your mic is active. Okay. He's probably facing tech challenges. Let me move to you, Commissioner Tracy Lynn. I'll go back to, I think you're unmuted now. Can you hear me, Becky?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. You can go ahead.
No, thank you very much for the report. I hope for us who are just outsiders will be able to receive the slides and be able to make a positive engagement in the future. My first comment is that we seems to be rich in analyzing our problems and suggesting the way forward. But despite that, it seems to me, that is my observation, we're unable to implement the suggestions that we are making. And I'm not getting an input here in the analysis as to why we are failing to do so. Only, I think Mark tried in his input around the question of funding. What is it that I think we need it or we lack doing it to be able to move? That's what my first comment. My second issue is about the affordability of the electricity as we're trying to move it on. And when you look to the municipality debt, and it suggests that unless we come up with a solution, the question of trying to just transform the electricity without looking in terms of how are we going to get the funding back in terms of those issues is eluding me, and I'm not getting a sense in terms of what needed to be done. And lastly, one of the speakers indicated that load shedding might be coming back as early as 2029. But I'm not getting a suggestion as to what is it that needed to be done urgently, because we know now that if those power stations are going to be out of action in 3 years' time, and it seems to me that there is no alternative that is being built to build it on. And I want to hear some comment. Thank you very much.
Great. Yes, I think one or two of our panelists will be able to comment on that. The IRP is very much modeled against least cost, and you're correct. We need to unpack further in terms of what least cost looks like in the face of decarbonization, in the face of industrial competitiveness, and all these other variables that were pointed out today, and also from a timing perspective, how that will be timed over the short, medium, and long term. That would also be interesting to reflect on. We will pick up on that when we go through a round of responses from the presenters. Prof. Tracy Lynn, you have the floor, and then I'll go to Neil after you.
Thank you, Chair. So the questions that I posed in the question and answer. Firstly, I'm wondering if the note can say more about the greening of steel and cement production. And then secondly, looking at the minerals that are necessary also for steel production, but also for the electricity transformation, and doing some work on critical minerals lately, I am concerned about the sort of refracturing of Africa along colonial lines with the rush for these minerals. And I'm wondering whether there is any scope for, South Africa taking a lead in regional and continental coordination so that we secure these minerals for Africa's development and South Africa's development. And then lastly, I just want to underline the point made by Commissioner Brandon that the direction of our electricity reform must be unequivocal. There should be no question about the direction we're moving in. If there is, we need to collectively understand what those bottlenecks are.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. Neil?
Thanks, Chair. And thanks to the speakers for really useful input. I've got a sort of comment for each speaker. I think for Kenneth, we seem to be underplaying the role of China in the post-Iran situation, both in terms of what they've done to safeguard energy sovereignty of the country, but also their role in securing global economic stability. There's a very fascinating YouTube discussion, which I'll post in the chat, which basically shows that China essentially halved their energy imports in order to avoid a global economic collapse. And I think analysis of that is very important. In relation to that, my question would be, what is the role for global South institutions together with China in coordinating an energy policy that is appropriate, meets our needs? For Lebo, it sort of relates to Tengo's comment, which is that, this notion of greater competition and vested interests, it seems to be code for Eskom's interests. Now, no one says that Eskom must remain as is, that the various embedded interests don't need to be challenged and transformed. The question of pricing needs to be addressed. But do we really seriously believe that we can advance this agenda, which the speakers have been speaking about, without a serious public renewables capacity? And this notion that PPPs and private sector role is going to solve the issues that seems to be quite naive. I mean, from 2 points of view. One is the profit premium, which basically means that prices will rise based on the profits which the private sector requires. And secondly, that possibly even more importantly, that the cross-subsidization of poor households essentially gets that connection gets severed. The second point to Lebo is correctly to connect it to industrial strategy, but has the PCC and the other institutions represented here done any modeling of how a beneficiation strategy can address can build our industrialization in the light of the energy intensity of those sectors, and how we can get around that? And finally, in relation to Mark, totally agree with the need to mobilize investment. But do we believe that without decisive state intervention and regulation, that the current trajectory in terms of lack of investment in infrastructure and the productive sector is going to change? And does he have any comments on the type of regulations and interventions that should be introduced, including the issue of prescribed assets for the retirement funds and the PIC? And does the PIC's current crisis indicate a challenge in that regard, or is that simply a governance issue? Thanks very much.
Thanks for that, Neil. I'm going to take Sine as the last hand before I do a round of responses. And linked to that question by Neil, Mark, as you prepare to answer it, is I think there was one posted by Alan on the 400 billion transmission build program, the 14,000 kilometers of transmission lines, and whether or not that's affordable, and how do we punt that against mini grids as a solution. So I think we can also link to that, how we are investing in new infrastructure in the energy transition, and whether or not it serves us in terms of our objectives. Sine, let me take your hand as the last one, and then we'll do a round of responses. Then we'll see if we still have time for another round.
Thank you, Dora. Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to touch on something that Mark actually alluded to, and that is the question on integration. I think the observation that I'm making is that some of the modeling and just like long-term planning, and I say this on the back of having attended to the DFFE LEDs, which is the long-term development strategy last week, is that there is lack of integration. And so even when we speak about CCS, it's for me just concerning that is put as a definite kind of solution, whereas it still faces commercialization challenges, for instance. And also there are concerns around increasing, whether it's PV, wind, especially BESS, but we're not talking about future waste or just even, resource recovery or anything that actually speaks to the downstream cycle of even the renewables. So I'd like to be able to just have comment around that and what the factors for consideration would be. Thank you, Dora.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Yeah, that was a mouthful. Let me then put them on the hot seat, but I will also welcome the three chairs as and when they feel they would like to jump in to also do so. Prof. Maluleke, Dr. Renosi, and Deepak Patel. If you feel there would have been a comment or you would also like to make a comment, you're most welcome to do so. Can I start with you, Kenneth, if you feel there was a question that you would like to then comment on?
Yes, thank you
for
very
you
much.
to give it a go?
Yes, I'll give it a go, some of the questions. I must say it's very useful to have this kind of engagement, and it will improve our thinking around these matters. I think, is it Brandon, Tengo, Tracy, Neil, Becky, others? I'm going to kind of mix them together rather than dealing with them all explicitly. I think there was like a theme regarding the private sector, public sector that comes through somewhat. And maybe we should look at exactly what we're talking about in that regard. I think Tengo spoke about we just wanting to leave everything to the market, and there's dangers in doing that. I wouldn't characterize it in that way. I think that we inherited a certain public owned corporations in the energy space. It was a vertically integrated electricity system with generation and transmission and distribution, and that with the technologies at that time, the larger the power stations, often coal or nuclear, and the larger the network effects, the cheaper the electricity would be. But what's happening is that the technology of producing electricity has changed. Just like we used to have landlines, now we've got cell phones. The technology of producing the cheapest possible electricity is no longer through a vertically integrated system, but is one where you have a distributed competition amongst generators, public and private generators. And the important thing, Tengo and others, is that the most strategic part of the modern way of running an electricity system, and throughout the world, hundreds of or more than 100 countries have unbundled in some form, is to ensure the most strategic part is the transmission part, because the transmission part is state-owned. It's a natural monopoly. And we're really focusing on trying to get our publicly owned infrastructure and companies to be structured in a way that will achieve the cheapest electricity. So that's strategic. We need that transmission system to be able to manage the flow of electricity across the country, to be able to, in a non-discriminatory way, allow private generators and public generators to be able to sell their electricity through that network. And that is a publicly owned network in almost all countries. And then you get to distribution and much more complex things where some countries have got public distribution, some have got a mixture of public and private. So it's really not correct to characterize that the proposal is just about leaving everything to the market. It's about structuring our publicly owned facilities and assets correctly. It reminds me what Brandon was saying is that what is the cause of the blockage? I think a lot of the cause of the blockage is not just vested interest. It's also misunderstandings because it's a complex process and the economics are complex, and we often just prefer to look backwards and say, can't we just run the world like we used to run it? But the lesson of this is that with the changes of technology, with the changes of doing things in more cost-effective ways, that we need to be able to be forward-looking in these matters. I think there's, in that regard, Brandon, there's a fundamental governance issue here because the South African government doesn't seem to have a clear champion of the public interest versus the interest of the publicly owned companies. So there's a combination of the shareholder and the policy making into one repository has led to, I think, some of these problems. I think that also Neil spoke about the fact that, well, when the private sector comes in, they want to make a profit. I mean, I've noticed some people are saying the cost of electricity has been rising in South Africa because we've allowed the private sector to enter, or because of this profit motive. We are not at that stage yet. We're not at that point where we can say that. It might be a critique that emerges later on. But at the moment, that's not what is. Electricity is generally being managed through the NERSA process, our electricity prices, and it's driven primarily by the costs associated with Eskom production, not about the private sector. There have been some IPPs and they were more expensive, but they've now come down in price, and every bidding window they come down further in price. So I suppose in the long run, what we're saying is that the private sector will bring two forces operating different directions on the generation side. The one will be competition will push prices down, and profit motive will push prices up. And if the competition is strong enough, the net effect will be that prices are going down over time if we're ensuring that competition is allowed to take place. So there's quite a few things here that I wanted to talk about. I just want to look at my notes quickly. Essentially, I'm saying that it's really not about privatization. It's about trying to ensure that we structure and build our institutions, our publicly owned institutions, in a manner that is fit for the task at hand. And also, when you talk about cross-subsidization, that comes out of the fiscus primarily. So the constraint there is low growth. The constraint there is low tax revenues. The constraint to growth, in my argument, is high electricity costs, which have been rising due to have been rising due to the factors that we've spoken about. If we want to see more cross-subsidization and subsidization of indigent and poor households, then this structure is more likely to bring the lower electricity costs, bring the investment, bring the growth, bring the fiscal capacity to do that. Hopefully then the virtuous circle is fewer households will be indigent and will be poor and will be requiring it. The other aspect, which I'm sure Lebo will talk about, and I'll leave it there, is there's also the social ownership aspect. In some countries, we're seeing that communities, because of the nature of this technology, it's not only about state ownership. There's private ownership, there's social ownership of this kind of infrastructure in communities. But I could go on all day. The speakers have provoked me, but I'll try and slow down. Thank you.
Yes, no, thanks, Kenneth. Let me move over to you quickly, Lebo, and you should also touch on the issues of scope of the paper, because there were quite a number of questions on that. Over to you.
Sure. I do want to just start quickly from where Kenneth has left it off. I understand where the questions on private versus public ownership are coming from. Beg is my former boss. I'm Tengo's former boss, and my colleague was Neil Coleman at some point. So I understand very well where the question is coming from. But the response has been covered by Kenneth in terms of this public vis-a-vis private ownership, particularly of electricity generation, because we're only talking about the electricity generation component here. But in this debate, colleagues, we're also missing the important opportunity that we are being presented with around the opportunity for social ownership models that can begin to emerge. In fact, in the advisory, what we then address is the fact that there is this opportunity that is being presented around models for social ownership, whether it's worker ownership, cooperatives ownership, women cooperatives and the like, and community cooperatives that can play a role, particularly in energy generation. The price of electricity, whether it's public or whether it's private, that is regulated through the electricity market, and the regulation of it is by the state. But really, there is an element here for social ownership of these renewable energy assets, which does present us again with an opportunity for a different type of cross-subsidization that we now see in this new electricity market. There was the comment, I think it was you, Neil, who raised around the issue that we are using the term market dominance as well as Eskom interchangeably. That's not what we're saying. The NERSA is currently busy with the vested contract framework as well as transitional pricing mechanisms. And what these are supposed to do is to ensure that the market can take place and can be fully optimized. And this is not to say that we are discarding Eskom in any way. These sort of frameworks are being put in place to ensure that they can be the required protection of Eskom's assets as they continue within this market, but then we can also achieve that low electricity price that we require. And then the scope of the work, which we did cover, is that we confined this work particularly to electricity reform and the industrial benefits that are linked to electricity reform, as well as the just transition. Issues related to, I know Commissioner Tracelyn, you addressed issues around the greening of steel as well as cement production, which we do cover, but very minimally in the advisory. But we do make the case around the need for greening steel as well as cement production.
Great. Thank you, Lebo. Before I go on to Mark, I'm going to request my colleagues from PEAC, NPC, and PCC. There's quite a number of questions that are coming through, some of which are very direct and specific. Please do your best to respond on the chat, because we might not get enough time to give verbal responses here. Mark, your responses, please. And I did see your hand, Siraj. Hopefully we'll get time to take it. Mark, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much for the great questions. I'm not sure that I share Kenneth's optimism on some of these reforms and what they can achieve, in particular whether increased competition, whatever that may mean, could result in lower prices. There's the institutional dimension of that is what really matters. I was part of a delegation hosted by State Grid, which is the Chinese grid company last year, the biggest grid company in the world. And what really struck me in China is my conclusion coming back from that visit was you have to make a distinction between state ownership and the market. In China, yes, there's state ownership of almost all the players in the energy sector. And there are thousands of them, but they compete with one another. So there's a market. And the state ownership means that there is a framework within which they compete. And that has resulted in the biggest grid in the world. That's 3,000 gigawatts. To put that in perspective, we're 48 or 60 if you add renewables. And and more than last year, more than 50% of that was renewables based. And as Neil and others have been intimating, their focus is on electrify everything, connect everything that you can to the grid, including hard to abate sectors, and then connect the grid to a multiplicity of technologies which they control. But the key factor, the reason why the market can work between a multiplicity of state-owned entities is they have their own capital. That is not true in our context. We allowed, as Siraj and many others on this call have pointed out, we've allowed the financialization of our economy and the export of capital on a massive basis. In 2023, the Minister of Finance allowed the 45% cap was introduced for the total amount of institutional capital that can leave the country. And within 3 weeks, 800 billion left the country. If anyone in China did that, they'd get shot. The same applies to the independent transmission projects, which somebody has already referred to. A big problem with implementation in the South African context is that we love to emulate solutions elsewhere rather than think through what is specific to our context. And that's what is happening with ITPs. ITPs, and I'm now talking in my own personal capacity rather than representing the NPC. ITPs are the RFP for ITPs specifies that the only EPCs that will qualify are those that have experience. And no South African company has ever managed a piece of the transmission grid. The entire grid's been built by South African companies, but they build them and hand them over to Eskom in the past, now NTSA. And so nobody has actually operated these pieces of infrastructure. And so they don't qualify. And these are the people who built the biggest grid in Africa. And the steel industry and the EPC industry has got mobilized around this and have been making submissions about it. But this is a good example where in China, they would never, ever think handing over the bulk of your biggest infrastructure project to international companies. That would never happen. Because they know you have to recirculate capital within your economy if you want to build. That's what a developmental state does. So, yeah, the procurement rules must change, bottom line. But, yeah, that's easy to say. It's a massive battle. And you're talking about powerful institutions that are putting pressure on the CIFSA, the Steel Master Plan Steering Committee, some serious players. But I'm not sure we're going to see the new RFP coming out towards the end of the year. We'll see whether they've made any impact. They've done a good job. One of my PhD students helped them write their document. So I mean, just to pick on, so I think if we make this distinction between state and the market, I think in the South African context, because we don't have sufficient capital, because of the financialization, we've had to now create a framework that allows us to mobilize capital under state direction. And that should not be diluted in any way whatsoever, because it is under state direction. But sometimes you can get the rules wrong. So I just want to pick up on one or two other points, if I can. The other institutional, the financial question that Neil raised, yes, I definitely think we need decisive state intervention, but we can't simply say that. We actually have to work out the detail. And unfortunately, insufficient work has been done on that. Mike Levington has talked about the PPP framework. It's been simplified, but it's a technical exercise. It's not a developmental strategy, which could be used in that way. So yes, when it comes to redirecting capital, the rules must change, but there is extremely limited understanding of how South Africa's financial ecosystem actually works. And I think, sorry, with due respect for the economists in the room, it's got a lot to do with economists who actually weirdly don't have a sufficient grasp of the way the financial system works. So I've been working recently with the pension funds to address this question, and they've de-skilled themselves. So they used to be able to do due diligence on actual direct investments in projects, but they've lost it, and that's the PEAC crisis. Isibaya was the unlisted book, and it's a mess, and that's a key driver of the problem. And so I think we have to build the capacity, a whole new generation of project preparation managers in a range of different institutions and who actually can do project preparation. I don't think we have the project preparation capability to achieve our infrastructure targets. Packaging projects, whether it's public or private, doesn't really matter. You still have to do the hard work. I don't think we know how to do that. And when it comes to the rules of the game, there's lots of jabber about the rules of the game at a very high generalized level. But unless you've got specific technical recommendations for the regulator, for example, to define infrastructure as a class of capital and requiring the institutional investors to include in their quarterly reporting what they are investing in infrastructure. If you don't have those two things, just two simple things, there's several others like that, nothing's going to change. But you got to do the hard work to figure all of these things out. So yeah, one very last point, sorry, is the vested interests. It's partly vested interests, Brandon, but it's also a bit too simplistic. So let me give you just one very simple example, which is referred to in the advisory note, which is that we have massively increased the pipeline of solar projects, both which are already operating, and there's another 26 gigs of solar in the pipeline. And at the moment, we've got too much energy in the middle hours of the day. And the reason for that is that coal-fired power stations can only ramp between 22 gigs and 15 gigs. You can't take it below 15 gigs. But renewables push the demand down below 15 gigs. So if you can't take the coal-fired power stations below 15 and you've got too much solar online, which is going to now increase, what do? You cut them off. It's called curtailment, but you still have to pay them. So South Africa is paying IPPs for electricity that is not being resold, is not being used. This is a recipe for disaster. And yes, you can reduce the coal-fired power stations, but then you need a lot of batteries to handle the peak, because we peak in the morning and the evening. So this is paralyzing what I've just described, which very few people understand, is paralyzing the energy transition, because the coal lobby is saying, you see, renewables are the problem, shut them down. And it's being explicitly said. And the renewables people are saying, well, shut the coal down. Yeah, no problem, but there's not enough batteries being procured. And sorry to say, you also need gas for backup when you have problems for a couple of days with no wind and no solar. So yeah, sorry to try and cover very complex issues, but I tried. Thanks.
Yes, no, quite complex. Thank you very much, Mark. I mean, we tried in the 2 hours to really try and solve whole of economy kind of a challenge. We were never even aiming to do that, but rather to stimulate discussion that would allow us to advise in a proper way, but then also to map out what needs to be done next. So this is the first of many other interactions that we would have. Siraj, I did note your hand earlier on, but unfortunately we have run out of time. So I did request that you please type in the chat, and we will take your comment or question into consideration as we go and refine the work. For now, let me hand over to Deepak Patel, who's the Deputy Chair of the Presidential Climate Commission, to do a quick sum up. It's a very difficult job given what has been discussed, but he will sum up a bit for us and give us his closing remarks. Over to you, Deepak.
Thank you very much, Dora, and greetings to everyone who participated this morning and afternoon. Until Mark gave his input, I thought I had the summation, but I'll have to go back to the drawing board. So I'd rather just make a few general comments and then, of course, commit to ensuring that, firstly, this conversation that has taken place finds its way with very sincere and due consideration into the final advisory. And Dora has also, I think, now promised that we need to have these engagements jointly convened between the PCC, the National Planning Commission, and the President's Economic Advisory Council. The PCC has always taken the view that there is no conflict between mitigation and reduction of emissions, economic and social development, and reindustrialization for competitiveness. Having said that, we have strongly advocated for our climate responses to be integrally accompanied by just transition strategies and principles. The notion of a just transition, whilst driven by a national intent to ameliorate the negative impacts on workers and communities, must also address inequality, unemployment, and inclusion. Our pathways analysis on an empirical and modeled basis, and that includes the joint analysis of the electricity sector done by the PCC, the NPC, the DBSA, and National Treasury through the SATIED program, shows that the sectors that are critical in this transformative journey start with energy and electricity. Also, as we've heard, in the context of the global geopolitical, trade, and supply chain disruptions, electricity and energy sectors present as the leading edge, both in terms of risk as well as opportunities. And here the imperatives are transformation of the electricity sector and finding answers to the challenge of grid expansion in the context of an increasingly renewables-led mix. The other sectors, referred to but not covered in detail in this advisory, are infrastructure in general, industrialization, critical minerals, transport, water, and agriculture. These require their own individual and collective strategies as we move forward. Adaptation and resilience efforts are also critical and perhaps need its own attention going forward. On financing, we know that developed countries, are refocusing their budgets and investments towards defense and their own energy security concerns. We must reduce our dependence and expectation of climate finance from international sources. In this context, clear signals and infrastructure financing innovation, accompanied by the hard work that Mark talked about, that of project preparation and project enunciation, it is critical to mobilizing, leveraging, and harmonizing of the domestic balance sheets, both public and private. This timely joint and integrated advisory seeks to advise on trade-offs where these are necessary, but more importantly, to give action orientation to our existing national suite of policies, the Just Transition Framework, the National Development Plan, the Integrated Resource Plan, our NDCs as committed through the UNFCCC system, SARAM, the Renewable Energy Master Plan, as well as our recently announced Industrial Development Strategy. The discussion that took place today will be fully considered as we finalize the joint advisory for presentation to the President very, very soon. On behalf of the PCC, PEAC, and the NPC, I thank you all for your valuable participation and contributions and wish you a pleasant day forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Deepak, for that. And as I said at the beginning of this session, we were not going to be able to respond to this many comments and questions, which is so exciting because it shows that we are all wanting to jointly work on this key issue. We are going to, yes, first, try and answer the direct questions, but then most importantly, integrate the inputs as we finalize this advisory note. We do have everyone's contact details. We will make sure that we share that advisory to the President, but then a lot of other comments are giving us inputs for subsequent advisories that will come up after this one. For us, it was quite critical that we have a public-facing debate or engagement before we finalize this particular paper and hand it over to the president, which will happen during the month of August, and we will yet again come back with another discussion forum. So if your question wasn't answered, do not feel disheartened. It has been captured, which is why we encourage that you type as much as possible. Those that were given verbally also captured accordingly, and as is our practice, we continue to engage and ensure that conversations continue. You have our contact details, so do contact. At the moment, the PCC is facilitating and coordinating the process. If your questions come to us and they relate to PEAC or NPCP, do rest assured that it will reach the partners accordingly. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Then the session is adjourned. Thank you, and thank you to the speakers for this morning. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.